Welcome to Tales from the Rabbit Hole. I'm your host, Mick West. My guest today is Nick Pope. Nick Pope is an expat Brit, just like me, and he is a British journalist and media commentator who is very well known for writing about the UFO phenomena. He used to work for the British government and handled UFO reports for the British government. So Nick, welcome to Tales from the Rabbit Hole.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for being here. It's great. It's like obviously a very interesting time in the UFO and alien enthusiast world. And I hear you just got back from Area 51.
Yes, indeed. I was covering the whole Let's Storm Area 51, the internet meme.
Right.
I was covering that for an upcoming TV show, and I spent 3 days up there interviewing and meeting event organizers, performers, speakers, cops, local people and attendees to just take the temperature and see what was going on. And it was very interesting.
So what types of people were actually turning up there?
It's interesting. It was fundamentally different to the average UFO conference, and it was much more the festival crowd. And I think part of that was obviously the fact that the initial Let's Storm Area 51 plan or joke, or however you characterize it, had by that time evolved into, well, let's not do that for very good reasons. Let's instead try to capitalize on that interest by running some sort of event. And in the end, actually, it turned out to be 3 events, one in downtown Las Vegas, one in the town of Rachel, and the other in the town of Haiku. So it got the festival crowd. There were more young people. There were more people who I suppose would I count as part activist, part just people who wanted to turn up, see what was going on, and wanted to be a part of something, I think.
Yeah, it sounded like you say, it was kind of like the festival type thing.
Not the average MUFON conference where there are a good bunch of people, but average age is probably at the higher end of the spectrum. A lot of retirees, a lot of the same faces. So this was something new, and I think that's interesting in what it maybe says about this subject, where it might be heading.
Do you think it's indicative, though, of like a new generation interested in the same type of UFO things, or is it a shift in kind of UFOs in culture?
I don't know. I mean, I think we are, and I'm sure we'll get on to discuss this, we are probably in a new position now to the position we were in around 18 months ago anyway, because of the revelations about the Pentagon's ATIP program, the US Navy encounters, congressional interest in all that. So I think things were changing anyway. This kind of came from left field, and I don't know whether it is going to be something that will last and grow and evolve year on year, or whether it was just one of those rather unusual, totally impossible to predict internet memes that maybe can't be repeated.
Yeah, it certainly seemed to kind of grow out of nothing. It was just a bunch of jokes and quite amusing memes at the start. But then I think a few people kind of took it seriously. Not very many, obviously, and even the people who were there, I guess, weren't exactly taking it seriously in terms of storming Area 51. They were just thinking, we'll go there and have a good time.
Yes, I think very few people were going there. I wouldn't even say it was a protest. You can have an argument about whether some of this is a protest against government secrecy or perceived government secrecy on this issue. I think it was more half festival, half, this is something interesting and different, half I want to be. I've heard it described as almost like a Burning Man for UFOs. Right. And I suppose there are people looking back who wish they'd been to the first Burning Man, which, according to some accounts, was simply 8 people on a beach somewhere. So maybe there was an element of that.
Yeah, well, I guess we'll see if it pans out in years to come. Did you kind of talk to people on the other side, like, say, the guards or the local officials in the area?
Yes, I talked to several cops and security people and interviewed a couple of them, and it was clear there was something of a charm offensive going on there. I don't know whether they have or will ever release it under the Freedom of Information Act, but clearly there was an integrated multi-agency contingency plan for this involving the US military, the police, and various other stakeholders in terms of the local community. And I don't think anyone was realistically ever expecting 3 million people to go. It's easy to click going on Facebook. Yes. It's much more difficult to actually go with something so remote. I think I timed it as over a 2-hour drive from Las Vegas to get there. Yeah. And of course, there's nothing there. There's Rachel has somewhere between population 49 and 53, depending on which census you look at, I think. And there's no grocery store, there's no gas station, there's no real infrastructure for this sort of thing. So it was quite an achievement. But yes, I spoke to the people, and at one point they were worried, I think, that maybe they'd have somewhere like 30,000 people turning up, and that would have stretched things beyond breaking point. There's an argument about how many people actually went. I'm not sure if we'll ever know for sure because they were split between multiple sites. I think somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 perhaps, but it's difficult. How do you count the people who turn up on a Friday and then turn up again on the Sunday? I don't know.
Yeah, it's funny. Like, you talk about people just clicking on the buttons. I have a niece in England who was like 15 years old, and she said she was going, but obviously she just clips. So people around the world have been interested in it, but obviously, yeah, it's like I say, it will be interesting how it turns out. So you mentioned a couple of minutes ago about how things have changed over the last 18 months, and I think it was Michio Kaku recently said that the burden of proof has shifted from people proving that UFOs are real to the military proving that they are not something unusual. Would you agree with that?
Well, I was actually there in Barcelona when he said that.
All right.
We were speaking at the same event, and I actually sat down and we sat in the restaurant for about 2 hours afterwards and had a chat about all this. I must say I was surprised to hear him say that the burden of proof had reversed, because I thought, I'm not a scientist myself, but I have to say I could suspect that some of his scientific colleagues might be bristling at that reversal. Where I think he is absolutely right is that the landscape has changed and that we're in a rather different place now, and that this has been elevated beyond just hearsay and crazy conspiracy websites. So it's taken to a new level. Whether the burden of proof is reversed or not, I think is a question for scientists. And if that's his opinion as a leading scientist, then that's fine. And I'm sure it's not universally held. But I listened to his presentation in Barcelona where he said that remark, and I think he repeated it afterwards in some media interviews. And of course, as I say, I was able to discuss this whole ATIP, US Navy video, associated DIA papers, business with him afterwards, and fascinating conversation it was.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm one of the people who would disagree with him about it being a game changer, because he spoke about you obviously heard it, and he spoke about science requiring evidence that is testable and repeatable and falsifiable. And he said that we now have that with these videos, and because he thinks that the videos show craft that are performing maneuvers that kind of break the normal understanding of aerodynamics and whatnot. Have you spent much time looking at these 3 videos that have been shown a lot recently?
Not a huge amount, and I'll have to say right up front, I'm one of these people who I hope knows what I don't know. So, for example, when I was doing this back at the Ministry of Defense, if we had photos or videos, I didn't sit down and try and start making calculations about distance from the lens or speed or anything like that. I simply handed them over to the intelligence community imagery analyst people and said, look, I want to tap into your resources and capabilities in terms of kit and expertise, and you tell me what I'm looking at. So yes, of course I've seen them, but I have no real idea what I'm looking at and couldn't hope to compete with those sorts of imagery analysts and pilots and whoever who have had a look at them. So I'm following the story, but I'm not pronouncing on it.
So when you did show these things to the expert, did they tell you what they were, and did they ever kind of come up with a unusual interpretation of them?
Well, you're talking historically at the Ministry of Defense about some of the cases. Yes, we didn't actually have maybe as many photos or videos as people nowadays might think. I was doing that job between 91 and 94. And back in those days, of course, people didn't carry cell phones and if we got a UFO witness who happened to have a camera around their neck, we counted ourselves lucky. So and most of the product that we did get, unfortunately, was just an object in the sky, but with no trees or ground so that you could really get to work on it. We did have one or two. There was one in particular, actually a case from a year before I joined, 1990. And this was a photo taken in Scotland. And certainly on that occasion, and when I started this job, we had a blown up poster-sized copy of it on my wall. Certainly there, the view from the Defence Intelligence Staff and also from a unit called JARIC, which was Joint Aerial Reconnaissance and Intelligence Centre, their view was, yes, this shows a real solid object, maybe somewhere between, I think it was 25 and 30 feet in diameter, not one of ours, don't know. And so, of course, to get an assessment like that was interesting. Yeah. But nowadays, with these videos, of course, one suspects, and in fact, one pretty much knows that there'll be someone in the system who has a lot more of the telemetry and other data than we have, and who has done a proper, one hopes, a proper assessment on this in terms of size, speed, distance, etc.
Yeah, it seems that the Navy is kind of saying that even though if they do investigate it and figure out what it is, they probably won't tell anybody because it's going to have classified status just by virtue of it being a military operation, which is very unfortunate.
It is unfortunate, and I have to say I've tracked these various statements that come out from time to time from Navy spokespeople, and I can't help but think, with my own Ministry of Defense background, I can't help but think that they're slowly but surely getting themselves into a bit of a mess over this, tripping themselves up, not quite remembering where they are and what they've said previously. I'm not necessarily saying the statements are mutually contradictory, but they're, certainly one or two of them do seem a little inconsistent. And it's like, well, come on, people, what's going on here? Give us something. And even, I suppose I know better than most, obviously, all the issues about classification and things, but I can't help but feel that someone somewhere should be able to step forward and give a sort of unclassified 101. And if the message is, look, when we use these various terms like UAP and UAS, we are exclusively talking about conventional stuff that we know about, whether it's commercial drones or balloons or whatever, then I think they could very easily diffuse this situation by saying, look, there's nothing spooky about these. Even if we use the term UAP, we're not using it in the way that the UK Ministry of Defence use it. And yet, one of the most recent statements, I think it was in response to I think it was Roger Glassell and or John Greenwald, said, no, this is a term we borrowed from the British. And of course, when we in the Ministry of Defence used UAP, we absolutely meant it for UFO. Well, you can come back and say, well, fair enough, but most of these UFO sightings turned out to be misidentifications, which is fair enough. But we used UAP more in our internal discussions, our policy discussions, not really with the public and the media. So when we talked about UAP, we were talking about that part of the phenomenon that we hadn't managed to explain away as aircraft lights and weather balloons and satellites. So were the US Navy being deliberate in that, or were they just being a little loose with it? I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting, the terminology with the UAP. Like someone was talking to me a couple of days ago, and they said, why did they call it unidentified aerial phenomenon? Because phenomena sounds like something amazing, like something that's phenomenal, or this like, unusual phenomena. But, my understanding of it was just being aerial phenomena, just something that happens, like something that's in the sky. It's not specifically something strange that's happening.
No, we used it simply because I suppose a meteorological phenomenon might not be an object, but it may still generate UFO sightings. So we thought UAP was a good way of sweeping up both objects and phenomena. However, as I say, I go back to the point that we kind of did mean it a little bit more spookily, maybe, just because we did reserve it for our more interesting policy discussions when we said, well, look, is there something here over and above all these misidentifications, hoaxes, and delusions?
Yeah. I suppose you would say the phenomena in general of UFOs, and then there's individual phenomena, which are individual things that happen. But yes, it's a tricky thing, language, is it?
It is, and the devil's always in the detail.
Yeah, I suppose like with UFOs, what you're talking about there was kind of, on the one hand, there's unidentified aircraft, and then there's unidentified objects, which you can't tell if they're aircraft or not. And then there's unidentified phenomena, which you don't know if they are just lights in the sky, or if they're actual objects in the sky, or if they are actually aircraft. So maybe the Navy should actually use unidentified aircraft for some other stuff, like airspace incursions, and then reserve phenomena for the more unknown type of thing.
Yes, and maybe within the bounds of not wanting to divulge classified information, but maybe some of these senators and other Congress people who have received supposedly a classified briefing on all this, perhaps some of those people, without crossing the line, could at least come right up to it and say, look, people, this is my best unclassified summary of what I've just been told.
Right, yeah. Are you still bound by any classification agreements or NDAs or anything like that from the British government?
Yes. On your first day in government service in the UK, you sign the Official Secrets Act, and then you re-sign a sort of reminder on your last day in government service. And what that does, amongst other things, is remind you that the fact that you've resigned or taken early retirement or whatever it is does not mean that your security oath has somehow magically come to an end. No, the Official Secrets Act is binding for life. Right. So the rule, the big part of that, of course, is not divulging any classified information ever. The reason that I can discuss the MOD's UFO work so openly is because 99% of it has now been declassified and released.
If there was some information that you couldn't release, could you tell us that there was information that you couldn't release?
Yes, and I could probably even... But yes, there is. But what I could then do is qualify it, and in trying to be helpful with this and saying, but no, the information that I have, which I'm not allowed to release, is not that we have a spaceship hidden in an Air Force hangar somewhere. Right. It is, for example, methods and sources by which information about UFOs was gathered from other nations. It is information about the technical capabilities of our radar system. So, for example, there are some documents kicking around saying, well, if there was something unknown in our airspace, we would be able to detect it out to a distance of X. So, so obviously I wouldn't want to go there because it would give away capabilities of military hardware. And with some information on UFOs and with other subjects, it's information passed in confidence by a third party, whether it's a nation or a corporation or something like that. Actually, probably 8 out of 10 redactions in the Ministry of Defense UFO files are simply names, addresses, and phone numbers of witnesses.
Yes. Yeah, it's... I think do you think the US has a kind of a stronger lockdown on things? It seems like they're keeping things classified by default here. Do you think one country is more open than the other, Britain versus the UK, Britain versus the US?
I find it difficult to judge. Even though I've lived in the US now since January 2012, I haven't ever worked in the US system, so I don't know. People say on UFOs, I hear people in the UFO community say, oh, Britain's released its UFO files, France has released its files, Brazil, Australia, New Zealand, etc. When will the US do it? And I would imagine that someone in the US is feeling pretty peeved because they would probably turn around and say, well, hey, look, we were the first.
Yes,
actually. The Project Blue Book archive is out there. But then, of course, there is the separate debate that between the end of 1969, when Blue Book was terminated, and a few months ago, the official line was, we're not interested, we don't do anything. So I guess there is a question about secrecy there. I mean, if anyone had phoned up the DoD press office prior to December 2017 and said, do you look at anything unidentified? They'd have said no.
Yeah. So what about the same type of thing in the UK, though? Like you left the DoD in 94. Do you know what happened after that?
Yes, I should say just on the dates, my time on the division where I investigated UFOs, that was 91 to 94. But that was part of a much wider 21-year Ministry of Defense career, which ran from 1985 to 2006 when I took early retirement. Now, I know that between 1994 and 2006, the UFO investigation and research went on, and indeed, because it's now been declassified and released, I've seen all those files. The research effort was finally terminated in the end of December 2009, although there are rumors, of course, that work continues, which wouldn't surprise me. Why would it not? Nobody's going to ignore credible evidence of something unexplained in our airspace, whether it's in the US, the UK, or anywhere.
Right. Did you leave because of any reason related to the UFO program, like because it was ending or anything like that?
No, I've seen some internet stories saying that I resigned in protest or something. Absolutely not true. Right. I just took early retirement because I want to pursue other things.
Yeah. It's interesting.
And 21 years was, these days I think 21 years would probably be considered a long time in an organization. But I've done some interesting, fascinating things, not just UFOs, but obviously in the course of 21 years in defense, one does a lot of interesting jobs, postings, but I'd done 21 years, and I just tried I wanted to change. So nothing UFO related, no resignation in protest or anything like that.
Yeah, that's about the same time I spent in the games industry, and I again also just left to pursue other interests. I think 21 years of doing anything is long enough for a lot of things. I asked you, that because I did doing some research before the interview, and there's lots of different stories about you on the internet. It's not all complimentary.
Oh, I try not to look at them. I mean, the amount of things that have been written about me in the blogosphere. I see some of them, but I deliberately don't go looking for all of them. I dread to think.
Yeah, I mean, there's this story about you saying there was an impending alien invasion. What was all that about?
Yes, that was me doing one of the things that I do now because of the work that I used to do is I act as consultant and spokesperson when there are various UFO or alien themed movies, TV shows, or video games. And for one of those, the part of the sort of rather fun, I thought, marketing campaign was, what if there was a real life alien invasion? How would we deal with it? What would the plan look like? And so I drew up, blending my knowledge of the UFO phenomenon with my more general sort of MOD, military warfighting. What does a real war plan look like? I wrote a spoof alien invasion war plan. Mm-hmm. And that obviously got put out there, and the company said something like, in the week in which we see the launch of whatever the game was, we asked what might really happen if this went down, and this is what we've come up with. And of course various people in the UFO community got hold of parts of this, and yes, the rest is history.
Yes.
There was, shall we say, there was a bit of a sense of humor failure in certain quarters.
Always a problem, isn't it? Yeah, because people want to believe certain things, and sometimes I try to avoid joking. In fact, I've actually got a rule on my website saying that people should avoid sarcasm because it goes wrong so very many times that people take you seriously when you're actually making jokes. So it's usually better to avoid it.
Yes, and tell you what else, government people tend not to do it very well. So, for example, we saw that just the other day with actually some of the media ops people covering the Area 51 story, and they tweeted a picture, as I recall, of a B-2 bomber and various men and women in uniform saying, if anyone storms Area 51, this will be the last thing you see. and then they had to retract it. And I said, obviously that wasn't going to happen. But it is just proof, if proof was needed, that government press officers and military PR staffs should not try to be funny. They should stick to just doing what they do.
Yes,
but don't try and make jokes. Don't try and be hip or funny. It just doesn't work.
Yes, it's like you got to know your audience, and they probably don't know their audience, so stay away from it. So, like, you talked about UFO culture. You mentioned UFO culture. Do you consider yourself like part of UFOlogy?
Not really. I've never described myself as a ufologist or UFOologist or however people. I'm simply an ex-government guy who once did this as my government job. Now, yes, of course, I do some TV shows where I talk about it. I do the consultancy and spokesperson work that we discussed on video games and movies and things. But I speak at these conferences. But I don't actually consider myself part of the community. I mean, maybe I should. I don't know. Maybe it's not even my call.
Well, yeah, I don't think there's a membership card. I suppose there are some organizations that you can join.
Yes, I'm certainly not a joiner.
Right.
I know people in MUFON, but I would not join. I know people in To the Stars Academy, but I haven't been asked to join, and I probably wouldn't. I'm just not a joiner of things. I like to go my own way.
Right. So To the Stars Academy, you said you probably wouldn't join it. Is that for any particular reason about what you think of them as a quality organization? No,
not at all. I mean, I haven't had dealings with all of them, but but from the limited interactions I have had over the years with some of them, and from the materials that I've read of others, I think, when one reads, for example, the things that Christopher Mellon has written as op-eds, I think, I could have, and indeed have, written some fairly similar sorts of op-eds myself, arguing for a more serious treatment of this subject. So when I see something like that, and when I sort of discuss this, as I have occasionally with Luis Elizondo, I sort of see, I suppose, somebody coming at it from the same angle. So no, it doesn't reflect any problem I have with them, simply back to the fact that I just, as a personality type, am not a joiner of things.
Right. What do you think of their approach, like right now, where they're doing like Discovery Channel shows that are kind of somewhat sensationalistic? Do you think that's a good way of getting the information out there?
It's a way of getting the information out there. I think it goes back to the fact that there are different audiences for this. And I don't think there's anything wrong in playing to the pop culture meme and doing those sorts of shows. Having said that, the arguably more important work that they do is probably things like the op-eds in the Post. It may reach a smaller audience, but it's arguably a more influential and powerful audience in terms of leveraging any change in policy. But I think I think you have to hit all the bases, and they've probably got a strategy that says, we need to be populist on this and do those sorts of shows, but we need to be niche as well and target that internal political audience.
I suppose you get asked all the time what you think about UFOs, like what do you think is actually going on, and like whether you think they are. Do you think that they are more likely to be aliens or more likely to be humans?
Well, let me give you my sort of basic answer on this. I am a fairly firm believer that there will be life elsewhere in the universe, and also a firm believer that some of that life will have evolved beyond microbial or simple life, and that there will be other intelligences, other civilizations out there. Some less evolved than us, some at our level, and others beyond, I suspect. As to whether we're being visited or not, I don't know. One of my favorite sound bites about all this, if you'll excuse me repeating one of my favorite sound bites, is that the skeptics have to be right every day. The believers only need to be right once.
That's great.
So I don't, I'm not, maybe it is. Statistically, obviously, I know from my own work that statistically it is, if you pick a UFO sighting at random, it is likely to be a misidentification. And the second most likely thing is probably a hoax, and the third most likely is some sort of psychological delusion or hallucination or vivid dream. But I don't rule out the extraterrestrial origin, and like I say, only one of those cases has to be the real thing, and we are in game-changing territory. So that keeps me interested and involved.
Yeah, I suppose the main one now that people are talking about is the Nimitz encounter, because they have the video of the Nimitz encounter is it's kind of a blurry blob in the distance. It's not hard to tell anything from it, but they have fairly good eyewitness accounts. They have this Commander Fravor who talks about seeing this tic-tac jumping around, and then there's the other pilot from the other plane, and then radar operators and whatnot from the ship. Do you think the Nimitz encounter kind of rises up to the top in terms of the most plausible UFO stories in the last 50 plus years?
Yes, I think it must be up there. And I would also say that I would not describe it as a single encounter, but as multiple encounters from what I understand. And the related 2015 incidents. And indeed, I would look at this holistically. When you look at what the Navy said, I think back in May, about issuing or reissuing guidance to pilots and other military personnel, they described this as being the result of I think the word they used was an upsurge in unauthorized incursions into restricted military airspace. So in one sense, I would lump all of this together, Nimitz, Princeton, Fravor, and the various other people, pilots and radar operators, who have now gone on the record with this.
Yeah, it's interesting to me that you talk about judging things holistically, because I always tend to try to break things down and look at the individual pieces of evidence. And it's always kind of this battle that I have with people in that, I say, I'm just going to look at this video and try to see what this video says. Like you could say, for example, the one piece of evidence you just said there, that there was an uptick in incursions into airspace, which could just be an uptick because drones are getting, individual personal drones are getting way more popular and cheaper and longer range and whatnot. So sure. Each individual piece of evidence can have some kind of explanation, but can you actually put together all these different pieces of evidence, which all individually might be explainable, and then say there's so many things that there has to be something there?
I don't know. It gets to one of the big problems we had at the Ministry of Defense with this. And yes, I take the point that each individual incident or case needs to be properly investigated. But one of my big complaints was that nobody did any trend analysis. Very few occasions did, for example, anyone sit down and do what I suppose you would call an intelligence assessment, where somebody tried to join the dots and say, well, if we put this together, what does this mean? Mm-hmm. So it was difficult to strike that balance between the individual incident and the overall picture. And I'm not claiming to have any right answer to the methodology of dealing with this. I mean, clearly, in one sense, you've got to do both.
Yeah. How would you say like cases like, so the Nimitz case differs from some of the more older classic cases, like the Rendlesham Forest case?
Well, I think actually Nimitz and Rendlesham do have some things in common, i.e. being multiple incident cases with a series of individual incidents, also being cases where there are essentially military witnesses to something and a paper trail of documents, some of which have been released and some of which presumably haven't, particularly with Nimitz and such like, where you can begin to say, well, we've got more than just hearsay here. We've got the military witnesses speaking out about this, but here we've got, for example, government documents talking about it. And actually, that's one of the interesting things I think about this whole story, is that in all the millions and millions of words that have been written, we've actually got comparatively few government documents. But we've got Senator Harry Reid's 2009, I think, letter to the Deputy Defense Secretary. We've got some of the initial contract solicitation documentation. We've got the DIA letter to Congress sent a few weeks after this story broke in the Times. People like Roger Glassell and Paul Dean and John Greenwald have solicited various other press officer statements, but we still haven't got that much. But to go back to your original question, yes, there are some commonalities, I think, and that's why I say this certainly goes into the top drawer if there is such a thing when it comes to these sorts of cases.
Yeah, for me, I always kind of found it interesting that when I ask people what their best evidence was for UFOs, you quite often get these cases that go back to the 50s. Like there was the guy who, got abducted from his car on a desert highway, like in the, I don't know, was it the 60s or 70s or something like that. These very old cases. But it seems like, like you say, we are getting a bit of a new thing. But was there kind of a golden age of UFOs, and then we had kind of a dip, or do you think it's been fairly constant, or what?
Well, I think like most things, there are peaks and troughs, booms and busts. I think one could say that obviously going back to the summer of 47, the whole flying saucer fever that swept the US and indeed the wider world, that was a big thing. Then certainly in the early 50s, maybe fueled to some extent by the difficult but undeniable linkages between this subject and science fiction and things like The Day the Earth Stood Still. But certainly there was a golden age in the 50s. Then there was a huge wave, I suppose, in 67, certainly in the US and the UK.
Yeah, with the space program.
Yeah, same in the 70s, and maybe Close Encounters of the Third Kind and the resurgence of science fiction with that, and then with Star Wars. Maybe that played a part, but these things don't generate. I don't think they generate UFO sightings. What I think they do is they create a fertile ground on which people who've had sightings can maybe step forward and say, well, I guess this is okay to talk about now. So, but it comes and goes. It comes and goes. In the 90s with the rise of the X-Files, then that was a big thing. But not all of this is sci-fi led. Some of it is just events led. And for example, the declassification and release of the British government's UFO files was a big story. And I would argue that prior to the ATIP story coming out, declassification of the British government's UFO files was one of the biggest and most important UFO stories in recent years.
Yeah. Well, slightly different tack here. What do you think about essentially the conspiracy theory version of UFOs, that the government is covering stuff up? Do you see any evidence that the government is deliberately hiding any information? And do you think it's even possible?
Yeah, not really. There's a very, very detailed essay on my website about conspiracy theories. And while I say don't discount everything, one or two conspiracies do turn out to be true. Most of the big ones, JFK, moon landings, Princess Diana, 9/11, I am not convinced by any of that. And neither am I convinced by the idea that there is a nebulous conspiracy to keep an alien presence from the public. I do not believe anyone has a crashed spaceship in a hangar anywhere.
Right.
But I do believe that the US government and the UK government consistently over the years have and still are grappling with something that they don't fully yet understand and have a handle on. So I see and indeed have been a part of what I would call a downplaying of official interest in and involvement with the subject. But I don't see a concerted effort to hide hardware, for example.
Yeah. So I suppose you're not a big fan of Bob Lazar then? Not a huge fan, but I fall back on the old adage, interesting if true, and clearly if he has other things to bring forward, I'm sure we'll all be interested to hear them. Yeah. I asked on Twitter for questions for you, and somebody asked me a strange question. Well, it was ask him why any moron would debunk the ET UFO phenomenon. And I think what he's asking there is, what do you think about the skeptics? Do you think that there are people who are too much in the naysaying camp, like too negative?
Yes, I think there's a spectrum. There's a belief spectrum, and again, this is one of my commentaries upon ufology. What I tend to find is that there's a belief spectrum with extremists at both ends. So there is a sort of wide-eyed true believer, it's all true at the kind of believer end of the spectrum. But equally, at the other end of the spectrum, there's a sort of none of this can be true, therefore it isn't true, as opposed to doing what the people in the middle should do, which is go in not with those preconceived beliefs, though obviously everyone has them, but go in and try to do an even-handed investigation or piece of research that is not conclusion-led.
Yes.
So I think long way of saying yes, there are extremists and nut jobs at both ends of the spectrum, and there are some sensible people, a lot of sensible people actually in the middle.
Yes, very true. And there's certainly a wide range of people in the UFO community. It does seem to generate a lot more passion than the other things that I look at. It's kind of strange that even, I look at things like chemtrails and 9/11 conspiracy theories and flat Earth. The flat Earth people are the nicest people. And I've got the most hate, I think, from the UFO people. It's kind of an odd community. I think perhaps it's something to do with the people it attracts, but I don't know. Do you get any sense of why there's so much passion in the UFO community?
Well, I think part of it comes from the fact that with UFOs, a part of the community are witnesses themselves, and a segment of those witnesses would categorize themselves even more deeply involved as experiencers and abductees, or whatever terminology they want to use. Therefore, those people have what they see as a personal connection and investment with the subject in a way that, say, people studying and debating the moon landings wouldn't. I mean, no, unless you were an astronaut, in which case probably that's why Buzz Aldrin punched that guy.
Indeed.
And actually, that's I suppose a good point. Buzz has that same personal connection. He actually went to the moon. Therefore, when he hears people say, "No, you didn't," he feels justifiably aggrieved. So perhaps that's the answer to the question. The witnesses feel that when people pour cold water on their experiences, they are being personally called liars, and their personal experience, whatever it was, is being disparaged, so they think. So I think that's why the passion.
Yeah, that sounds like a very reasonable explanation, and it certainly rings true with a lot of my encounters with people. They will often kind of berate me with some evidence and then kind of eventually fall back onto that they saw a UFO fly over their car or whatever, and that there was no way I could possibly convince them otherwise. And so it was basically, if I persisted, then it was like I was calling them liars. And so they tended to be a bit reactive against that.
Sure, that's why I guess the James Fox film, I Know What I Saw, was a good title. That's the one, isn't it? I Know What I Saw.
Yeah, I don't remember. But
yeah, I think so.
We'll
anyway.
So, this has been a very interesting conversation. What are you working on now? What's coming up next for you down the pipe?
Gosh, lots of different things. I'm continuing to appear as contributor on various TV shows, but I'm also actually trying to develop and create some shows myself so that I have more control over the overall look and feel and content of a show. So I'm doing some writing and development work with production companies and networks. I also occasionally get outside of this subject. So I've written, for example, a couple of sci-fi novels. My most recent book was actually a thriller about terrorism and intelligence work and special forces. So again, nothing to do with UFOs or the unexplained. I guess I have my finger in a lot of pies.
Yeah. So what's going to be different about your show that you're trying to develop? What's the different tone you will be taking?
I'd like to bridge the ufology with the science a little more, I think, and just ground it a little more in, well, firstly, is this possible? And secondly, if it's possible, how would it work? Not just, here's another case. I mean, I think we've all seen those TV shows where people run around and, point in the sky or whatever. It's the sort of ufological equivalent of the ghost shows where everyone's like, what was that? What was that? I don't want to, there are probably some very good shows like that, but that's not the show I want to make.
Yeah.
So I want to explore bridging that gap a little bit and actually asking the next questions. I mean, there's no point having a UFO show about is it real or not? Because you're only going to recreate the whole skeptic versus believer dogfight. Why not ask the more interesting questions? Well, look, if it is true, what next?
Yeah, that's a good question. What is next? Do we? I guess you want to try to contact them.
Yes, and that's
study them.
Absolutely. That's why my two favorite sci-fi movies are Contact and Arrival, because they speak to the far more interesting questions about could we communicate, and if we could, what would they have to tell us? What would we teach each other?
Yeah, that sounds fascinating. Just going back to your work at the MOD, some people say you exaggerated your role at the MOD. Is there some reason why people are saying things like that? Whether people say there was that false story where you left in a huff because they cancelled the program. Are there other kind of false things like that floating around?
Oh, there's lots of false things floating around, and it's self-evidently not true, because I took early retirement in 2006, and yet the UFO program wasn't terminated till 2009. Right. So that's demonstrably false. I think where the problem lies is that all sorts of things get written about me that I don't really have much control over. So, for example, I worked for the Ministry of Defense, but one or two people in writing about that have said, particularly overseas conference organizers, where something maybe gets lost in translation, that I was the Minister of Defense. Maybe that's an easy mistake to make, particularly with different languages, or maybe not. I don't get to see all that stuff, so I can't police it and I can't correct it. There was another point that got made. Some people in the UFO community try to use me. Some people, so therefore, depending on where you sit on this belief spectrum, I have had people try to over-exaggerate my role, and I have had people try to underplay and diminish my role. Now, here's one example of the latter. I use in my media interviews the phrase, I ran the UFO program or the UFO project, because the actual situation was that, unlike the United States Air Force, where they gave it a project name, Blue Book, we in the UK didn't have that. We simply said that it was work embedded in a particular directorate in the Ministry of Defense, and over the years that changed. Well, as you can imagine, if I started talking to the media about Secretariat Air Staff 2A or Defense Secretariat 8 or Directorate of the Air Staff or any number of these other things, it would be meaningless. So I use a kind of conversational, does what it says on the tin shorthand. Well, I investigated UFOs for them. I ran their UFO program. And then somebody said to the Ministry of Defense, well, what was this UFO program? And they said, well, we didn't have a UFO program. Technically, that's true, because it never got called anything. But there is, and it's somewhere in the UK parliamentary record of proceedings, Hansard, a member of Parliament tried to clear this up by asking what was Mr. Nick Pope's job between 1991 and 1994. And the answer came back, he was posted to a division where his duties included investigating UFOs. So, so it's like, as ever with the internet, the answer's in the middle.
Yes, I see this kind of inflation and or deflation of credentials all the time when people want to...
I've been told that, yeah, some people say I was the minister, I was the Secretary of State for Defense. Other people imply I was the tea boy who literally, made the tea and did the filing of the papers. So, if indeed such a thing is done in these days.
Yeah. So what percentage of your time did you actually spend on like UFO stuff, and what percentage was on other stuff in that 91 to 94 period?
Almost impossible to say. I would put it at somewhere between, I maybe 50% by the end of it. My other duties covered things like actually reading and then doing the security clearance of books that had been written about the Gulf War by people on the Air Force side.
Interesting.
And doing war games where, again, on the Air Force side. Now, I was a civilian, but this job was to do with Royal Air Force matters. So we would do the war books and we would do the war games. I think I can say what these things were called now. Things like Wintex and Cymex and Purple Monarch and Purple Warrior. These integrated war games that we play to exercise our transition to war and war rules. So I did some of that. I did some of the security clearance and vetting of books that people had written, and I did the UFOs. And it was, I think, particularly later in that tour of duty, I think it was probably about 50-50 with the UFO work. But very difficult to say because it was events-led. I would have whole days where no new cases would come in, and I wouldn't be doing any UFO work at all. Right.
Yeah, it's not like they're on a schedule or anything. You mentioned the Gulf there, and I think one thing about the recent stuff like Gimbal and Go Fast and stuff like that is that they mentioned seeing them when they were in the Gulf. Did you get reports from the military of like military pilots seeing UFOs in the Gulf?
Not in the Gulf, and certainly during the hostilities. If we did, we would probably have thought, well, it was AAA. Yeah. And the other thing was, although we occasionally relaxed this, our terms of reference were limited to investigating sightings within the United Kingdom air defense region.
Oh, right. So if a pilot did see a UFO then, like overseas, a British military pilot, where would that report go to?
Well, one hopes, would have reported it initially, as with most things in the military, up the chain of command. And I hope that had those sightings taken place, they would have been forwarded back to me. And, over the course of the MOD's years of looking at this, I think we did have some sightings probably from Cyprus and the Falkland Islands and places, but not many. Not many.
Was there any cooperation with other countries, like cross-referencing databases for UFO sightings? Did you share them with other countries?
Very little, and that again was partly a construct of our very narrowly defined terms of reference. And partly just, I think, the difficulty in identifying opposite numbers who were doing this. I've heard it suggested that the European Union or even the United Nations should take a role in this. Don't know whether it would work or not. I don't think the UN want it. But no, there was very little cooperation. In my true believer moments, I speculate that one reason for that is that if any of this is true in terms of being extraterrestrial, the nation that first acquires that technology will have a decisive strategic advantage. And therefore, even if you think there's a vanishingly small chance of it being true, it's probably treated within government, well, it is. I know firsthand from the UK, it's treated as a low probability, high impact scenario.
Yeah, interesting.
And so the thinking probably is we wouldn't necessarily want to share this even with our allies.
Right, yeah. They would keep it to themselves so they can make their flying saucers and anti-gravity drives.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
And when one looks, we could do a whole second show on this, but when one looks at those research papers that the DIA told Congress they produced under the ATIP program, it takes you to some fairly interesting territory in terms of wormholes and warp drive and such like.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if it is true, then that's some pretty, advanced technology with some very interesting implications. But as you say, probably a topic for another show.
Yes, and of course, my final thought on that, I guess, my late father was an aeronautical engineer, and he always used to say, well, theoretical physics is fine, but someone's got to be able to actually build something.
Yes. Yeah,
and there is that. Sometimes, as I say, I'm not a scientist, and I'm certainly not an engineer either, but reading some of this material, you can't help but think there's maybe a disconnect between this and actually putting something together physically and building it and saying, here it is.
Yeah, I think it's all very well saying a wormhole is possible, but...
Yes, minds far sharper than mine will have to pronounce on that.
Yes, indeed. All right. Well, thank you very much, Nick. This has been a very interesting conversation, and I think we've probably cleared up some things for some people, a lot of questions people had. And probably
created a whole bunch of new ones in other people's minds too.
We shall see. We shall see what the reaction is, because, like I said, there was a lot of different opinions on the internet about you.
Sure. When you put it on Twitter, and I guess I'll do the same if you send me a link.
Sure.
I guess we'll see what people think.
Indeed, it will be very interesting. All right. Well, thank you very much.
Okay. Nice to talk to you.
You too. You have a good day, and I'll send you a link as soon as it's up.
Thanks very much.